3 years of work were on the screen when the door opened. The CEO's niece walked in, smiled at the investors, and shut me down mid-sentence. My slides vanished. She said they didn't need my ideas anymore. Said it softly to me, then louder to the room. Everyone watched. No one objected. In that moment, my role, my work, and my future were taken in public. What they didn't realize was that by humiliating me like that, they'd crossed a line they couldn't step back from. If you've ever been pushed aside after doing the real work, subscribe and tell me in the comments what you would have done next. The conference room was quiet except for my voice and the low hum of the screen behind me. I was halfway through the third slide when the door opened. Not a polite knock, just the sound of glass and hinges pulling attention away from my words. The CEO's niece walked in like the meeting had been waiting for her. She didn't apologize. She didn't look at me. She went straight to the head of the table, leaned toward the investors and said, "Sorry to interrupt. There's been a change of direction." My clicker froze in my hand. One of the partners glanced at me, then back to her, like I'd already become background noise. She reached for the console and minimized my presentation with a single tap. 3 years of work disappeared from the screen. "We won't be needing these ideas anymore," she said, finally turning her head just enough for me to hear it, her voice low, precise, and practiced. Then she straightened and addressed the room. "We've developed a more commercially viable approach." That was the moment. The line wasn't just crossed, it was erased. No one asked me to sit. No one asked for clarification. The CEO didn't look surprised. He didn't look at me at all. He nodded as if this had always been the plan. She pulled up her deck and I recognized it immediately. Not the slides themselves, but the structure, the phrasing, the assumptions, the conclusions that only made sense if you'd lived inside the work for years. Concepts I'd never formally presented. Things I'd explained offhand in late-night conversations, scribbled in notebooks, walked through at a whiteboard when she'd stood beside me pretending to learn. She spoke confidently, using my language without knowing it was mine. When she finished, the room applauded. One investor even stood. "This is exactly what we were hoping to see," he said. "Much cleaner, much easier to scale." I closed my laptop, not dramatically, carefully, like someone packing up after a meeting they were no longer part of. No one noticed. I slid my badge out of my wallet and set it on the table near the edge where it wouldn't interrupt the conversation. As I stood, the CEO finally looked at me. His eyes moved past me like I was already gone. "Enjoy the funding," I said. My voice didn't shake even though my hands did. I walked out before anyone could stop. Me. In the elevator, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for a follow-up meeting I wouldn't be attending. By the time I reached the parking garage, my email access was already gone. That was confirmation enough. I sat in my car and waited for the anger, the panic, the urge to go back upstairs and demand an explanation. None of that came. What came instead was clarity. They hadn't just taken credit. They'd made a public decision that they didn't need me anymore. And decisions like that have consequences. I drove home, already counting time, not days, hours. By morning, they'd discover the first problem, not a dramatic failure, something quieter, a system that wouldn't resolve, a process that stalled just enough to raise questions. They would assume it was a mistake. They would call a meeting. They would demand answers. That was when the second shift would begin. Because what they didn't understand in that room was simple. They hadn't taken the work. They'd taken the appearance of it. And appearances don't function without the person who built them. The first thing I noticed wasn't anger from anyone upstairs. It was silence. No email asking me to clarify. No message from leadership smoothing things over. Just absence. By mid-morning, my calendar invitations vanished one by one, meetings quietly removed as if they'd never existed. When I tried to log into the internal dashboard from home, the page loaded halfway and froze. Not locked out completely, just enough access to see that something was wrong and that no one knew why. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was a short text from someone on the operations team. "Are you still in today?" I didn't answer. 10 minutes later, another message came through, this time from someone higher up. "Quick question about the deployment flow." Still no explanation. Still no acknowledgement of what had happened in that room. By early afternoon, the tone changed. Messages stopped asking questions and started asking for time. Can you jump on a call? Need 5 minutes. Urgent. I ignored all of them. At 2:17, the building security app notified me that my badge had been officially deactivated. That was the only formal communication I received. No HR email, no exit paperwork. Just a quiet administrative decision confirming what had already been said out loud in front of investors. I took a walk instead, not to cool off, to think clearly. By the time I got back, the missed calls had stacked up. One from a director I hadn't spoken to in months, two from a project manager who never contacted me directly before, then a voicemail from the CEO's assistant asking me to connect briefly before end of day. Still no apology, still no correction, just urgency without accountability. I opened my laptop and reviewed what I'd already prepared weeks earlier. Not documents, timelines, dependencies, points where things could slow without immediately breaking. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. They were already walking into it. At 3:40, a message popped up from someone in finance. Do you know why the numbers won't reconcile this afternoon? That was the crack, small enough to be dismissed, serious enough to make people uncomfortable. I pictured the conference room again, the confident smiles from the day before, the certainty in their voices. Certainty doesn't age well when systems stop responding. By the end of the day, the calls became less polite. One voicemail ended with, "We need you to be reasonable." I deleted it without listening to the rest. Reasonable had been available yesterday. Today was about consequences catching up. At 6:03, my phone finally rang with the one number I expected. I let it ring until it stopped. 5 minutes later, a text appeared instead. We should talk. No explanation, no ownership, just an assumption that I would still respond on command. I closed the laptop and set my phone face down on the table. The power had already started shifting. They just hadn't accepted it yet. The call came the next morning, not from the CEO, but from legal. That told me everything I needed to know before I even answered. They weren't calling to apologize. They were calling to contain damage. The voice on the line was calm, practiced, and careful with every word. We'd like to understand what's happening, she said, as if confusion were mutual. I told her I was happy to listen, but I wasn't available to troubleshoot. There was a pause, the kind that meant someone else was signaling in the room. Then the CEO took the line. He skipped pleasantries. You embarrassed us, he said. Not we made a mistake, not we crossed a line. Us. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable. Yesterday, he continued, was handled poorly, but that doesn't justify what you're doing now. I asked him to be specific. Another pause. Systems don't just stall on their own, he said. People cause that. I corrected him once, calmly. I didn't touch anything. He shifted tactics immediately. Fine, then help us fix it. There it was, the assumption that I would still step in when summoned, still clean up after decisions made without me. I told him I wasn't employed there anymore. He argued that I hadn't resigned properly. I reminded him that his niece had made my role obsolete in front of 6 partners and a funding committee. That was optics, he said. This is reality. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked who else was on the call. He hesitated, then admitted legal was still listening. I made my next words precise. I'm not comfortable discussing internal systems for a company I no longer work for, especially when I was publicly told my ideas weren't needed. That changed the temperature instantly. Legal cleared her throat. The CEO lowered his voice. We can make this right, he said. Title: Compensation. You don't need to take this personally. I told him it wasn't personal. It was structural. He didn't like that word. He asked what I wanted. I said nothing. Not yet. That frustrated him more than any demand could have. He warned me about contracts, about obligations, about how messy things could get if I pushed this too far. I reminded him that messy had started when my work was taken and presented as someone else's. The call ended without resolution, 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was the niece. She didn't bother hiding her anger. "You're doing this on purpose," she said. I asked her what she meant. "You know exactly how this works," she snapped. "Just tell them what you told me." I asked her to explain what she told the room yesterday. She went quiet. "You said you had a better approach," I continued. "If that's true, you don't need me." She accused me of sabotage. I reminded her I'd been told I was no longer necessary. She hung up. By noon, the pressure intensified. Emails marked confidential. Meeting requests framed as urgent. One message tried a different angle. "Think about your reputation," it said. That one I answered. "I am," I wrote back. "That's why I'm not participating." An hour later, a calendar invite appeared for a meeting I hadn't accepted, scheduled in a room I no longer had access to. That was when it became clear they weren't trying to understand the problem. They were trying to force compliance. They still believed authority would work if applied hard enough. They hadn't realized yet that authority without leverage is just noise. By mid-afternoon, the issue was no longer theoretical. It showed up in rooms that mattered. A partner call scheduled to finalize numbers ended early. A routine operational check failed twice and was quietly postponed. None of it triggered alarms yet, but it forced explanations, and explanations exposed gaps. People who had never needed to understand the system before were suddenly asked to explain why it wasn't behaving the way it had for years. I wasn't there to watch it happen, but I didn't need to be. The messages told the story. Questions turned sharper. Requests became demands. Someone forwarded me a screenshot of a meeting invite labeled containment. I didn't respond. By late afternoon, a senior director reached out directly, not to fix anything, to ask whether I was open to being flexible. I asked what he meant. He said the company was facing pressure and that it might be in everyone's best interest to stabilize things quickly. I told him stability requires clarity, and clarity had been removed the moment my role was dismissed in public. He said that wasn't how leadership saw it. I said leadership wasn't seeing much at all. That ended the conversation. The next signal came from outside the building. A longtime partner requested updated documentation that had never been requested before. Another delayed a signing, citing internal review. These weren't technical concerns. They were trust checks. When systems that have always worked stop behaving predictably, people stop assuming competence. They start asking who actually knows what they're selling. That question doesn't stay contained for long. Internally, the response was predictable. Leadership blamed execution. Managers blamed teams. Teams blamed each other. I heard later that a room full of engineers was told to figure it out by end of day. That kind of directive only works when someone in the room understands the full structure. No one did. By early evening, my phone lit up again. This time, it was someone from compliance. "We're reviewing access histories," the message read. "Can you confirm whether you removed anything prior to leaving?" I replied once. "I removed nothing." That was true. I hadn't needed to. The silence that followed was longer than before. That was the moment the tone changed across the board. It stopped being about blame and started being about exposure. At 7:12, an executive I'd never spoken to before called me. He introduced himself quickly and skipped formalities. "This is becoming a problem," he said. I asked him to define problem. He said the wrong people were asking the wrong questions. I told him that usually happens when the right people were ignored earlier. He offered to set up a conversation off the record. I declined. Off the record only benefits the side trying to rewrite it later. An hour later, I received a forwarded internal memo from a former colleague. It wasn't meant for me. It outlined talking points for leadership if partners asked about the interruption during the pitch. The phrase, strategic realignment, appeared 3 times. My name didn't appear at all. That told me they were still betting on control instead of truth. They believed they could smooth this over long enough to get through the next round. They believed appearances would hold. Appearances always hold until they don't. The final signal of the day came just before 9. A partner pulled out of a joint appearance scheduled for the following week. No explanation beyond timing concerns. Timing concerns are what people cite when they sense instability, but don't yet have proof. I shut my laptop and sat there for a moment, not celebrating, not anxious, just attentive. This was the point where the problem stopped being mine. It was theirs now, fully and publicly. They had removed the one person who could explain what was happening, and in doing so, they'd forced everyone else to explain it instead. That never ends well. I went to bed, knowing that by morning containment would no longer be possible. The situation had moved beyond internal fixes. The consequences were about to become visible to people who couldn't be pressured into silence. The shift became undeniable the next morning when the requests stopped pretending to be optional. I woke to a voicemail marked urgent from someone on the partner's side, not internal. He didn't accuse or demand. He asked a single question. "Can you explain why yesterday's numbers couldn't be reproduced this morning?" I returned the call, not to solve anything, to clarify ownership. I told him I wasn't affiliated with the company anymore and that I couldn't speak on their behalf. He asked if I could speak for myself. I said yes. That distinction mattered. We met later that day in a neutral conference room downtown. No logos, no assistants, just a table, a screen, and two people who needed certainty. I didn't bring files from the company. I brought my own materials, prepared weeks earlier. When I walked them through the process at a high level, I kept it plain. No jargon, no theatrics. I showed what worked, then showed why it worked, then showed why what they'd seen in the pitch could never produce the same outcome without the underlying structure. He listened carefully, stopped me once, and asked, "So the version they have is incomplete?" I corrected him. "It's a surface." He leaned back. That was the moment. Not anger, not shock, recognition. He asked why the company believed they owned the full capability. I told him they owned what I built on company time and company equipment, which was sufficient to demonstrate potential but insufficient to operate independently. He asked if that separation was documented. I slid a folder across the table. Timelines, logs, agreements, independent verification. He didn't read it all. He didn't need to. He asked one more question. "If they asked you to come back today, could this be fixed quickly?" I said no, not because it was impossible, but because the trust required no longer existed. That answer carried more weight than anything technical. By the time I left, he hadn't promised anything. He didn't need to. He understood the risk. Within an hour, my phone lit up again, this time from inside the company. The CEO called twice. I didn't answer. Legal sent an email requesting a meeting to clarify misunderstandings. I replied once, stating I was open to discussions that involved my counsel and acknowledged my independent work. The reply came back faster than expected. Understood. That single word told me they'd connected the dots. By mid-afternoon, rumors started circulating. Partners were asking pointed questions. Leadership meetings were being rescheduled. Someone forwarded me a message where the phrase, "Who actually owns this?" appeared more than once. That's the question companies fear most when narratives collapse. Late in the day, the niece reached out again. This time, her tone was different. Controlled. Careful. She asked if we could talk privately. I agreed on the condition that it be brief. She started by saying there had been a misunderstanding. I stopped her. "You said my ideas weren't needed," I said. That wasn't ambiguous. She argued that execution was a team effort. I agreed. Then I asked who on that team could explain the decisions behind the structure she'd presented. She didn't answer. I told her I wasn't interested in blame or credit anymore. I was interested in separation, clear lines. She asked what that meant. I said it meant they stopped presenting what they couldn't operate, and I stopped being pulled into conversations designed to extract answers without accountability. The call ended quietly. That evening, I received confirmation from the partner I'd met earlier. They were pausing all forward commitments until ownership and capability were clarified. That pause was the lever. The company had built momentum on certainty. Once that certainty cracked, everything slowed. And when momentum slows, people start asking who built the engine in the first place. They had believed they owned the outcome. That day, they learned they'd only been borrowing it. By the following morning, the tone shifted from urgency to panic. I didn't hear that directly from leadership. I heard it from the edges, from people who suddenly had too much information and nowhere to put it. A former colleague sent a single line, They're locking rooms. Another followed an hour later. Emergency board call. These weren't operational responses, they were defensive ones. When organizations start sealing themselves off, it means the story inside no longer matches the one they've been telling outside. Around mid-morning, a partner postponed a joint session that had been advertised publicly. The explanation was vague. Scheduling conflict, internal alignment. Words that buy time when confidence is gone. Internally, the pressure broke downward. Managers demanded updates that no one could provide. Teams were told to document processes they'd never fully understood. Someone tried to recreate workflows from old decks and screenshots. It didn't work. It couldn't. The system had always required judgment at key points, and judgment doesn't transfer when the person who exercised it is removed. By noon, the CEO sent a company-wide message acknowledging temporary disruption. Temporary is what you call something when you still believe you can contain it. An hour later, that belief collapsed. A second partner paused involvement entirely, citing risk review. That one couldn't be explained away. Risk review is what happens when trust erodes. I was asked, through legal, to confirm whether I was speaking to outside parties. I replied that I was speaking for myself, as I had every right to do. The response came back slower this time. I could imagine the conversation it triggered. Every option they discussed required cooperation they no longer had. Mid-afternoon, the niece resigned. It wasn't announced publicly, but word traveled fast. The explanation shifted again. Personal reasons, strategic refocus. When someone exits at the center of a credibility crisis, everyone understands what it means even if no one says it. Shortly after, the board convened without the CEO present. That detail mattered. Boards remove obstacles when outcomes matter more than loyalty. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. What was unfolding wasn't revenge. It was gravity. Systems return to balance when artificial authority is removed. Late in the afternoon, I received one final call from the CEO. His voice sounded different. Tired, stripped of certainty. He said my name like it carried weight again. He asked if there was any path forward that didn't end in collapse. I told him the collapse wasn't coming. It had already happened. What he was feeling was the delay between action and consequence. He accused me of being calculated. I agreed. Calculation is what happens when you're forced to protect work that others treat as disposable. He asked if I thought this was fair. I told him fairness had been decided the moment my role was erased in public. The rest was just follow-through. He didn't argue after that. He thanked me, quietly, for being honest. Then he ended the call. By evening, the story shifted externally. Partners issued careful statements. Commitments were reframed. Momentum reversed. Internally, people updated resumes. Some reached out to me privately, asking where I was headed next. I didn't answer those questions yet. The point wasn't recruitment, the point was control. They had built an image that depended on my silence and availability. Once that was gone, they had nothing left to negotiate with. When I shut down my laptop that night, it wasn't with relief. It was with finality. The situation no longer required my attention. The system had corrected itself. The week ended without a dramatic announcement, which felt appropriate. Collapses like that rarely happen with a single headline. They unravel quietly, decision by decision, as people choose distance over defense. By Friday morning, partners had redirected conversations away from timelines and toward alternatives. Internally, leadership stopped asking how to fix things and started asking who would take responsibility. That question traveled upward faster than anyone expected. I stayed out of it. I had already stepped clear. What remained was mine to build, not theirs to recover. I spent that day meeting with people who wanted clarity instead of control. No pressure, no assumptions, just direct questions and direct answers. When I spoke, it was as the owner of my work, not a subordinate explaining it. That difference changed the room. Conversations moved faster. Decisions landed cleaner. No one interrupted. Late that afternoon, I received a short message from someone on the board. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an accusation. It simply said, "We misjudged where the value actually lived." I didn't reply. Acknowledgement doesn't require response. That evening, a courier delivered a small package to my door. Inside was a notebook I hadn't seen in months, the one I'd assumed was gone for good. No note, no explanation, just the return of something that had never belonged to them in the first place. I set it on the desk and didn't open it. The work inside it had already moved on. Over the next few days, the updates filtered in without effort on my part. The CEO stepped aside by mutual agreement. Several senior leaders followed. The company released a statement about refocusing priorities. People read it carefully and understood what it didn't say. I was asked more than once if this felt like victory. It didn't. Victory implies competition. This felt more like alignment. I had built something real. They had built an image around it. When the image collapsed, the real thing remained. That was the only outcome that mattered. A few former colleagues reached out cautiously, asking if there might be room where I was headed. I told them to wait, not because I didn't want them, but because I wanted to build deliberately. Rushed growth creates the same conditions that led to the collapse I just watched. I wasn't interested in repeating anyone else's mistakes. The final call came the following Monday. A partner confirmed their decision to move forward independently with me. Terms were clear. Expectations were explicit. No ambiguity about ownership, authority, or credit. When we hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet and let that settle. Not the relief, the permanence. Nothing from that conference room could reach me anymore. The power they thought they had was conditional on my participation. Once I withdrew it, everything rebalanced. I didn't take satisfaction in their losses. I took satisfaction in the simplicity of the outcome. Do the work, protect it. Walk away when it's disrespected. Let consequences do the rest. If you've ever been told your contribution didn't matter, only to watch everything stall without it, you already understand how this ends. And if this story sounds familiar, stay with me. There are more lessons like this that don't come from revenge, but from finally refusing to be erased. I didn't win by being loud. I won by being prepared, and preparation has a cost people don't see. While others celebrated, I spent nights labeling files and writing dates. Every document was a reminder that trust had limits and memory fades when power is threatened. The day my work was erased in public, the quiet work became the only thing that mattered. What surprised me most was how calm strength feels when it finally surfaces. There was no speech, no confrontation that changed minds. There were folders, timelines, receipts. When leadership panicked, I didn't argue. I let the record speak. That's the hidden strength no one trains you for. Patience that looks passive until it isn't. If I'm honest, the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was carrying the weight of readiness for months without knowing if I'd ever need it. I missed dinners. I skipped weekends. I learned to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen. That discipline hurt, but it also freed me. When the moment came, I didn't need permission. I had proof. Here's what I'd tell a friend facing something similar. First, write everything down, even when it feels awkward. Second, separate your work from your identity so you can protect it without begging. Third, don't rush to expose leverage. Let pressure build naturally. Quiet strength works best when it arrives on time, not early. How to get started today. Create a private log for decisions, dates, and approvals. Save copies of work you create on your own time. Reduce verbal promises. Ask for confirmation in writing. Notice who interrupts you and who documents outcomes. Prepare exits before you think you need them. What quiet step can you take this week to protect your work before someone else claims it?